Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic on? I'd like to start first by thanking the organizers here. We made it through lunch. You're all still standing, or sitting, rather. Let's give a round of applause for Mary, who did a really wonderful job, and Frederick, a wonderful job putting this all together and getting everyone in this important industry in the same room. And with that, let's get to work here. So we're going to talk a bit about cybersecurity issues that are facing luxury brands. Focusing primarily on the DNS, the domain name system. And we're sort of an interesting law firm in that we generate and have created a threat intelligence platform that's used by some of the largest financial ratings companies in the world to detect nascent threats, cyber squatters, et cetera. And we report on them on a daily basis. We also track a lot of active threats. We're going to go into some active threat intelligence data. And I'm going to demonstrate how cybersecurity and anti-counterfeiting can be based on the same threat intelligence feed, and that there's a lot of crossover when it comes to detecting, disrupting, and identifying these particular counterfeit networks. I will also preface this by saying that several years ago, my law partners and I made a solemn obligation to never, ever use clip art. So what we have created for you hopefully will be interesting. We've created an art gallery for you, so even if you find what I'm about to say boring, at least you'll have some real art, not clip art, to look at. No balaclavas, guys in balaclavas, at keyboards in this presentation, I promise you. So with that, we'll start with some fundamentals. The domain name system. Now this may be somewhat simplistic for you, so we're going to try to run through it. This has been a critical component of the internet, but there's also been decades of abuse. Now think back to this. This was Mercedes-Benz in 1995. This was before there was election interference, before there was GDPR, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, before there was that horrible word that begins with B and ends with REXIT, which we won't say. This was state of the art 24 years ago. It was kind of the glory days when I look back at it. But then you had, a few years later, your first UDRP filing, which most of you know, is the sort of mini arbitration proceeding by which domain names are reclaimed, and the WWF was the first plaintiff, the first complainant in that, and our very own Frederick Mostert was actually instrumental in creating the UDRP system with ICANN back in the late 90s. I'll date him a little bit. But this has become a real problem for so many companies because it's a real game of whack-a-mole. But nowadays, if you don't pay attention to this, this has become an IP issue with security implications and a security problem with IP implications. And that's created a really dangerous blind spot here. And it's dangerous because there's a rift of responsibility. If we look at the data from the Internet Security Threat Report that Symantec puts out once a year, the 2018 report, which was based on data from 2017, indicated that 1 in 13 URLs on the Internet was malicious. That's a big problem. That was an uptick of 2.8% from 2016. The recent report that just came out, which is based on data in 2018, indicates that this has changed again, and it's now 9.9%, or just about 10% of URLs on the internet are actually malicious. This has led to very prominent breaches like WellPoint, CareFirst, Primera, OPM security. OPM stands for the Office of Personnel Management, which manages all federal employees for the US government. And because I worked in defense and intelligence, I actually got 2 data breach notification letters from the federal government when they were popped, most likely by the Chinese. And we want to show you a small snippet of data here about what can happen if you just completely don't pay attention to what's going on in the domain name space. And you have to think about the DNS as sort of like a garden. And I know that you English love gardens, and I've lived here, and so let's think about it that way. Weeds are going to grow in an unattended garden. And for this exemplar, we need to find an organization that was sort of asleep at the switch, woefully ignorant of things going on around it. So we use the Trump organization. And if you take a look at this is just a small snippet of the permutations of domain names that do not belong to the Trump organization. That basically, it's almost every single permutation of Trump.com, which is owned and operated by others, and all of this can be a very big problem. But this is surface level stuff. These are fundamentals, as I mentioned. They're easily exploitable, but they can also be remediated. The more difficult stuff is really what is below the surface level here. This is where the danger is today. and where we see things progressing both from an anti-counterfeiting and cybersecurity issue. And this has to deal with the very difficult and unregulated section of what's known as DNS-A records, or subdomains. So subdomains look like this, and this is some active threat intelligence for you. The domain that we're looking at here is gov-survey.org. That's what somebody registered. A subdomain is when you create another name on top of that domain. Sometimes it's called a third-level domain, but in common parlance, it's a subdomain. So if you have a website that begins with gov and you create a subdomain on top of it, it can look like whatever.gov and you can impersonate the US government. Or if it begins with com, it's the same issue. So here, this was a domain that was active in the summer of 2018, just ahead of the midterm elections in the United States, and you'll see that the first domain there is floridavotes.gov-survey.org, impersonating a Florida voting website. And then you have impersonation of the HR function of the Treasury Department, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, as well as a fake news site for the Treasury of the United States. So these subdomains have become a very, very difficult and unregulated portion of the internet. And what's very unique about these is that they can be created by anybody at any time. There's no registrar for subdomains at all. There's no central repository. There's no whois data that's associated with them. And critically, there's no legal authority, like the UDRP, to take down a malicious subdomain. So with that, we see criminals using subdomains to launch a variety of attacks because primarily it evades most online brand protection. And we see a lot of activities like credentials harvesting, Outlook web access duplication, duplication of single sign-on credentials, misinformation campaign, business email compromise like financial redirection, and counterfeiting networks now using the exact same methodologies. And they do this because they need to fly under the radar, because flying under the radar for them is persistence, and persistence equals profit. And the way in which they do that is they know how brands protect themselves, so they try to evade this. And they'll create generic domain names with non-FQDN subdomains. FQDN in the information security community stands for fully qualified domain name. So luxurylawsummit.com is a fully qualified domain name because you have the name, plus .com. So the second level domain plus the top level domain. So Luxury Law Summit is just a name. So we see these non-FQDN domains. So if they wanted to impersonate Luxury Law Summit, they wouldn't use luxurylawsummit.com in a URL string. They just use Luxury Law Summit. We see that with brands. We see that with counterfeiters in many, many different industries. And they do this as well, not just by registering generic domains that aren't going to alert you, alert your brand protection mechanisms that you may have in place, but they hack other people's domains that have been around for a long time. They use that longevity as an indication of trust, and then they layer on top of those DNS-A records or those subdomains. And if we can track this, and this is what we've designed our intelligence platforms to do, right, by taking in massive amounts of data from various sources, if we can track cyber criminals in this way, we've realized that we can actually track counterfeiters in this way as well. So let's take a look at some counterfeiting examples. We didn't want to give you examples that focus specifically on the luxury industry because it might be somewhat embarrassing a little bit. We'll show you a tiny little snippet that I'm not making this up in a little bit. So the examples I'm going to use to show you are from the pharmaceutical industry right now. So we'll look at some pharma examples, and then I'll show you how there's crossover with the Luxury Law Summit and luxury brands. So Levitra. Levitra is a very popular erectile dysfunction medication, and it's very expensive in the United States. It's about $73 a tablet. It's very highly counterfeited. We know that counterfeit sales fund organized crime around the world, and ingesting these particular pills can carry significant health risks. So what we're going to show you here is actual live data, but a very tiny snippet of active data of marketplaces focusing on Levitra and counterfeit sales of pharmaceuticals. So every single one of these sites here has Levitra in the subdomain space, and every single one of them is a marketplace hiding in that particular subdomain space. And you look at, for instance, in the middle, waitressStation.com Has nothing to do with Levitra, has nothing to do with pharmaceuticals, and you would never be able to pick that up if you weren't monitoring this particular space. Let's look a little further. More subdomains, more. Every single one of these is a counterfeit marketplace. And even more. And let's focus on one and go down the rabbit hole with one particular site and show how we can begin to use this data to detect the networks. So we'll look at levitragenerique.tiemain.com. So tiemain.com. Does anybody want to venture a guess what tiemain.com could relate to? Don't be shy. You're not all British, come on. Somebody can volunteer, right? It has nothing to do with Penang curry, my favorite Thai dish. It is, however, the government public relations department of the Office of the Prime Minister of Thailand. That was the domain. It was actually used by the government of Thailand for a number of years, but is now disused for a number of years, probably over a decade. It's existed since 1999, and it's been hacked and abused by these counterfeiters. And they, again, the longevity of a domain name is very, very valuable to these counterfeiters or threat actors, because the longer a domain name exists, the less likely it is that an anti-spam or an anti-phishing mechanism is going to rate it as a high risk. So that's why they focused on something like tiemain.com, which continues to be registered, but is not maintained by the government of Thailand. And then one of the subdomains was levitragenerique.tiemain.com. We'd look at that, and there's our counterfeit marketplace selling not only Levitra, but also Viagra, Cialis, and Camagra. And this is a French language counterfeit site, I should say. It's not a French site. Another subdomain on that was cheapcallstoturkey.tiemain.com. And we found a counterfeit calling card site on that particular domain as well, using the same exact template as the Levitra counterfeit site as well. And then, curiously, 5diamondcats.tiemain.com as well, because you can't go too far on the internet without running into cats. So this was really weird, let me tell you. This was an actual replication of a Pennsylvania cat breeder website on tiemain.com. We were looking at this, the only thing we could figure out was maybe this was like a proof of concept test, but more likely we think what was going on was this was probably used to distribute malware on some kind of forum like Reddit, where they embedded the URL somewhere. They might have been targeting somebody specifically who was looking for, at this particular breeder, replicated that site, and then use that to distribute malware. So let's take a look at the distribution networks here. Counterfeiters need traffic to go to these particular counterfeit sites. Whether they hack the site, whether it's a generic site, they only exist and they're only going to be profitable if they can drive traffic there. So what they do is they try to divert legitimate traffic that's related to the counterfeit, but they don't necessarily want to target that counterfeit because it might alert your brand protection mechanisms that you have in place, right? So they have to do this somewhat under the radar. But the traffic that they're diverting, those visitors need to have some kind of interest in whatever the counterfeit that's being sold is. And this is the same across the luxury space, as the same across the pharmaceutical industry as well. So with respect to counterfeit erectile dysfunction medication, anybody want to guess what they're focusing on? I know you're a little shy here. Pornography. This is what they're doing. They're registering domain names that look similar to legitimate pornographic websites that people would visit, and they have hundreds and hundreds of these pornography sites. And when you visit one of these pornography sites, it looks like a real pornographic site, it acts like a real pornographic site, but popping up are ads for these particular counterfeit marketplaces. And that's how they drive traffic here. They're cyber squatting on industries that relate to what they're trying to sell. And this is a great way of tracking these particular threat actors, as well as looking at the networks of the domains that they're using to funnel traffic over there. And that's where we see people making a lot of mistakes as well. So if we understand the MO by which these subdomains and these marketplaces are created, we can identify the reach and scope. We can collect historical data about what these counterfeiters have been doing and what they're currently up to, because then we can also begin to track them in real time. And we can often find these counterfeit marketplaces way before they're actually set up. We detect them as they are being configured. And then once you have a handle on that, then you can prioritize your enforcement actions. You have an understanding of how large the network is, whether this should be something that should go directly over to your anti-counterfeiting team, should this go to law enforcement, is it not worth your time and effort? And then we can very often achieve attribution as well. Attribution means who's behind this, who are the networks of actors, where are they located? And that is very much predicated on the collection of the historical data, as I said, because it's that information in the past that we see a lot of these threat actors making big mistakes. And a lot of the data that we collect is pre-GDPR, which means that even the who is information could have a lot more clues about where these people are, who they are, where they're located. At that point, it becomes possible to disrupt the network. So this is data that's valuable to anti-counterfeiting, to brand protection, and luxury space, and we'll show you that I'm not making this up, a tiny little snippet of one domain that is targeting Chinese VIPs in the .ru space, but also has a bunch of counterfeit marketplaces for Hermes, Michael Kors, Polo, Celine, etc. And this shows you that when you look at this, you're going to find information about your competitors, not only your own brand. And this data, here's where we're going to talk about the crossover into cybersecurity as well. Because if you're looking at this type of data, this type of threat intelligence feed, it can be very relevant to mitigating a cybersecurity disaster as well. So let's think about that. We had a situation within our law firm. We monitor the DNS for a lot of big healthcare organizations. We had a single healthcare client that was being targeted with a subdomain in a very effective attack. And this was a domain that was hacked that related to a bridge players club in the Miami-Dade area in Florida. And when we went down the rabbit hole looking at that attack, because it was very sophisticated, very unique, what we saw were infrastructure targets, not just our healthcare client. And we began tracking these. And we're still tracking them literally to this moment. And what we saw were major sectors of the U.S. economy, critical infrastructure under threat by the same actor that was targeting our client. We saw the energy sector targeted, pharmaceutical companies being targeted, medical facilities and hospitals all around the country, universities, mostly research universities that would have DoD-related contracts, defense contractors themselves, heavy industry, mostly as it relates to construction and offshore oil drilling, government targets at the state, local, and federal level, including school districts. And what we're seeing now, which is very concerning since Thanksgiving in the United States, is a major focus of this APT, this advanced persistent threat, on food distribution networks within the United States. Outlier targets that we've seen were a single Lebanese attorney being targeted by this particular threat actor that works in the technology sector. We also saw a very high-profile Qatari ambassador being targeted by this particular APT. That ambassador was Yusuf El-Qatar, who is the UK ambassador the Qatari ambassador to the UK. He's sitting just a few miles away from here in Mayfair. Our attribution conclusion here is based on a lot of open source intelligence, and what we think after about 8 months of collecting data here is that what we have been looking at and what we've been tracking is APT-10, which is run by Chinese intelligence. And if this is not Chinese intelligence, because there is a direct overlap with the targeting of APT-10 and these targets, then what we found is a completely separate state-sponsored actor, which we think is even more significant than APT-10. So we started with a single subdomain. We're now, as of today, tracking 457 domains of this particular APT. We think it's their entire infrastructure. We've seen over 1,150 companies targeted. As of this morning, we detected an attack against a major lumber supplier in Vancouver, British Columbia. And the way in which they do this, we're going to show you exactly how it works, is that they impersonate the HR functions of these companies. And looking at that historical data, we've been able to identify that the actors behind this are Malaysian, and a lot of the historical data points to networks of actors in Malaysia. We have some direct evidence and circumstantial evidence of this, but there's been a real crossover to some luxury brands being targeted by this APT as well. In fact, there may be some of your brands here in the audience that have had discussions with me about this because your brand might have been targeted. We'll look at right now at an attack on Christie's. That was exists in the subdomain space here. We've had to redact the domain because there's active law enforcement investigations against this APT. And if you look here, what they do is really quite interesting. They use the logo. This looks like a legitimate HR employee satisfaction survey is what they use this for. They make it appear as if you're on their intranet as well. If you see they have documents, important files, survey information, you fill out the survey. They have the name of the company. There's no bad English here. They even pay attention to copyright notifications as well. 2018 copyright Christie's over there. And then once you fill out the survey, oh yes, you have to give your username and password. That's then processed on the server side by a PHP script that gives your credentials away to this particular actor, and within minutes, your organization is breached. And this is the same threat intelligence that we use to detect counterfeiters as well. So some takeaways here are that it's very important to mind the domain name system for intelligence here. It's critical, and the way in which we do this with most of our clients is that we funnel the data that we provide to them to 3 different departments at least. Most of the time it goes to the legal department, it goes to incident response, and it goes to cybersecurity. In the luxury sector, what we generally do is we hand it over to the legal department for IP brand protection activities, anti-counterfeiting departments. This data tends to keep them very busy as well, which they like. And also the cybersecurity department, perhaps your incident response department, depending upon whether it's a real active threat like the APT that we just saw. So my point here is looking at this data, the threat actors are moving at a pace that really outstrips a lot of the technological means that we use to track and detect them. And ordinary brand protection that focuses primarily on your brand name is no longer sufficient. There are plenty of other sources of intelligence about what's happening to your company that don't necessarily involve your brand. If you're just looking at the domain name system, you're missing out on the subdomains, you're missing out on the generic domains that are being registered every day that could be used to attack you at any minute. And we think it's really important to think about luxury or the pharmaceutical industry or the heavy industry, as a collaboration here, because we really believe in sharing this intelligence, not just internally with your colleagues, but also with your competitors. We hope that sharing this intelligence would foster a lot of goodwill between what would otherwise be competitive entities, because working collaboratively is really the only way that we can stamp out this problem. And when you share information like that, and you share it internally, and you disperse it to various departments and components, and you may even get information from your competitors, you can really become the hero there, avoid the blame game, because we all know what rolls downhill when there is a breach. And we detect activity like this on a daily basis, and in terms of disrupting these networks, we work directly as well with the Free Group International, which Louis Free was before Robert Mueller, and before Robert Comey, he was the director of the FBI. So we work very closely with them, and we have data centers in New York and Wilmington, Delaware, and London, just a few miles away in Mayfair as well. And that's a lot of information, and that's me, and I don't know if we have any time, but I'd be happy to open it up to questions.